Rain fell in silver ropes over the city of Ashvale, the morning Isolde Bramwell arrived at the palace gates wearing her dead mother's traveling cloak, and she told herself, as she had told herself every mile of the muddy road from the borderlands, that she would not bow her head to a king who had never once ridden out to see what his taxes had done to the people who paid them. She was 23 years old, her boots were split at the seam, and she was not supposed to be here at all. The invitation, if a conscription notice sealed in black wax could be called an invitation, had come for her younger sister Marguerite, the prettier Bramwell, the one their father had always said would marry well enough to save what little remained of their name. But Marguerite had taken a fever 3 weeks before the summons arrived, and by the time it broke she was too weak to survive the 10-day journey east, let alone a royal trial. So Isolde had gone in her place, because someone from House Bramwell had to answer the crown's call, or be named Oathbreakers. And oath-breaking in the kingdom of Ashvale was not a metaphor. It was a brand, and it was hereditary. She had never seen a Lycan king up close. She had heard the stories. Of course, everyone in the 7 border provinces had. King Cassian Ashworth had taken the throne at 19, when a wasting sickness took his father, and, 6 months later, his mother, leaving him the youngest Lycan sovereign in 3 centuries, and, by every account Isolde had gathered on the road, the loneliest. He ruled a kingdom held together by an old and brutal magic, the bond between a Lycan king and his true mate, a bond that steadied the pack magic threading through every province, every border ward, every silver mine that kept the wolves fed and the humans safe from what lived beyond the Ashvale tree line. A king without a bonded queen was a king whose kingdom slowly, invisibly, came apart at the seams, crops failing in provinces that should never fail, wards thinning at borders that should never thin. It had happened before, generations back. It was. Isolde had heard whispered in every inn from the border to the capital, already beginning to happen again. Hence the trial of 30, an ancient rite, revived by royal decree, in which 30 women of noble or notable blood would be presented to the king one at a time, permitted a single audience, a single chance to speak with him, because a Lycan's nose does not lie, and somewhere among 30 honest cents, the king's advisors believed his wolf would find the one truth that mattered. Isolde thought it was theater. She thought most things the nobility did were theater. She stood now in a receiving hall with marble floors so polished she could see the chandelier trembling in them, surrounded by 29 women in silks she could never have afforded, and she gripped the strap of her travel bag like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "You're shaking," said the woman beside her, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in deep green that made her look carved from jade. "Don't. He can smell fear. Apparently, he can smell everything." She said it lightly, but there was an edge under it, something worn thin. "I'm not shaking from fear," Isolde said, which was mostly true. "I'm shaking because I've been on a horse for 10 days and my legs have forgotten how to be legs." The woman's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Lady Celestine Rowe," she said. "4th in line for Rowe Hold, which is a polite way of saying I am nothing to my family unless I come back from this palace with a crown on my head or a very good excuse." Isolde Bramwell. She did not elaborate on what she was to her family. There was no polite way to say it. A steward moved down the line with a silver tray, and on the tray were small crystal vials, and one by one the women were dabbing perfume at their throats and wrists, some kind of pale floral scent that Isolde didn't recognize. And when the tray reached her, she waved it off. "You'll want that," Celestine murmured. "Steward Thorne says it steadies the nerves before the audience. Everyone's been given it since dawn." "I don't have nerves to steady," Isolde lied, and did not take the vial, because she had exactly 4 coins to her name, and had learned a long time ago not to accept gifts from men who managed other men's fortunes, and Lord Alaric Thorne, Regent Steward of Ashvale, the man who had all but run the kingdom since the old king died, had the particular smoothness of someone who had never given anything away for free in his life. She watched the other women glisten with the pale scent. She watched Celestine hesitate, then dab a single drop at her wrist, quick and almost apologetic, as if asking Isolde's forgiveness for the small betrayal. One by one, the doors to the throne room opened and swallowed them. One by one, they came out, some flushed with triumph, some pale and stiff-shouldered, one weeping quietly into a handkerchief before composing herself for the walk back to the carriages. Isolde watched 30-1 and heard, through the heavy doors when they cracked open, fragments of what passed for courtship in a throne room. Your Majesty, your reign has brought such prosperity. Your Majesty, the border provinces sing your praises. Your Majesty, I have never seen a king so wise, so strong, so— By the time it was Isolde's turn, dusk was pressing violet against the tall windows, and she was the only one left standing in the marble hall, and Steward Thorne himself came to fetch her, his smile a fraction too wide. Lady Bramwell. He said her family name the way one might say the name of a disease currently in remission. The king will see you now. Do try to be brief. His Majesty has had a very long day of compliments. I imagine he has, Isolde said, and followed him in. The throne room was vast and cold despite the fires roaring in 3 enormous hearths, and King Cassian Ashworth sat not on the throne itself, but on the steps below it, elbows on his knees, looking less like a monarch and more like a man who had been awake for 11 years straight. He was younger than she'd expected, or perhaps not younger, but tired in a way that made him seem both older and unfinished at once. Dark hair pushed back from his face, amber eyes that tracked her across the room with an intensity that had nothing courteous in it. 31, he said, before she had even reached the base of the dais. His voice was low, rough at the edges, a voice that had perhaps not spoken kindly to anyone in some time. Thorne told me there'd be 30. Who let you in? I let myself in, Your Majesty, Isolde said, though I understand the crown sent for my sister. She's ill. I came in her place, because House Bramwell doesn't have the luxury of ignoring a royal summons, even a cruel one. Something moved behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or the ghost of it. Cruel, he repeated. Rounding up 30 women like prize cattle to sniff out which one loves you best. Forgive me, Your Majesty, I've had 10 days on a horse to think about better ways you might have spent your afternoon. Behind her, she heard Thorne make a small strangled sound. The king did not look angry. He looked, if anything, awake for the first time since she'd walked in, leaning forward now, elbows still on his knees, studying her the way a man studies a locked door he's just heard rattle. Say something kind about me, Lady Bramwell. Everyone else has managed it. It's traditional. I don't know anything kind about you, Isolde said. I don't know you at all. I know that the silver tithe from the border provinces doubled last winter, and nobody in this palace seemed to notice that 3 villages went hungry to pay it. I know that the wards at Halloway Pass have been thinning for 2 years, and the Crown's response was to send a letter, not a garrison. I know you're 25 years old and everyone in this room is terrified of you, and I don't think you like that. But I don't know you well enough to say whether you deserve it or not. So no, I won't flatter you. I came because I had to, and I'll go home the moment you release me, and you can find your queen among the other 30, because I imagine at least one of them meant what she said. The silence afterward had a texture to it, thick as the perfume still hanging faint in the air from the women who'd come before her. Except, she realized, with a small cold jolt, she couldn't smell it on herself. She'd refused the vial. She was the only person who'd walked through those doors all day, smelling of nothing but rain and horse and the road. The king rose from the steps. He crossed the space between them slowly, and when he was close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, he inhaled, not subtly, not politely, an open, unhidden breath, the way she imagined wolves must breathe when they were deciding whether something was prey or something else entirely. You're not wearing Thorne's rosewater, he said quietly. I couldn't afford it, Isolde said, which was true. though not the whole truth. Everyone else took it free from the tray. I don't take things from men who smile like they're already spending my inheritance. The king's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. An expression like a muscle remembering emotion it hadn't used in years. He turned to Thorne, who stood very still near the doors, his composure a half-second too careful. "Leave us," the king said. "Your Majesty, protocol dictates. Leave us, Alaric." Thorne bowed and left, and the doors shut behind him with a sound like a held breath finally released, and King Cassian Ashworth looked back at Isolde Bramwell with an expression she would spend the rest of the night trying to name, and said the words that would unravel everything she thought she understood about why she'd been summoned at all. "Do you know, Lady Bramwell, you're the first person to walk into this room in 11 years who didn't smell like a lie." They did not announce a winner that night or the next, and Isolde was given a small guest chamber in the palace's east wing, not the luxurious suites where the other candidates waited in restless, gossiping clusters, but a modest room near the servants' stair, which she suspected was Thorne's doing and did not mind in the slightest, because it was quiet and it had a window that looked out over the kitchen gardens, rather than the ornamental ones, and something about rows of actual turnips growing in actual dirt made the palace feel less like a stage set. She did not see the king again for 3 days. She spent them instead in the strange, suspended company of Celestine Rowe, who had apparently also not been sent home, and who found Isolde in the library on the second afternoon, curled into a window seat with a book on Ashvale's border ward history that she'd stolen. Borrowed, she corrected herself, from an unattended shelf. "You're still here," Celestine said, settling across from her with the particular relief of someone who has found the one person in a crowded room who isn't performing. "So are you." "I'm here because Thorne told my mother I showed particular promise," Celestine said, with the flat delivery of someone quoting a phrase she despised. "Which I think means I said the right flattering things in the right flattering order, and now I'm meant to linger in case you fail spectacularly, and the king needs a second choice." That's a horrible thing to be told. It's a horrible thing to be, generally, in my family. Celestine picked at the edge of her sleeve. "Fourth daughter of Rowe Hold means fourth in line for everything except obligation, of which I get a full share. If I come home a queen, my mother finally has to be nice to me. If I come home nothing, I go back to being furniture." She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. "What about you? What do you get if this goes well?" Isolde thought of her sister's fever-thin face, of the silver tithe notice pinned to their door 2 winters running, of her father's slow collapse into a man who apologized to his own daughters for failing them, and then failed them again the following season. "My family gets to stop drowning," she said simply. "I don't particularly care what I get." Celestine studied her for a long moment. "He hasn't sent for the others again. Only you, so far. Apparently..." Lady Vashti heard it from a chambermaid who heard it from someone in the kitchens. "He asked for you again this evening." He had. A steward, not Thorne, a quieter, older man named Pell, came for her an hour before sunset and led her not to the throne room but to a smaller chamber, a study lined floor to ceiling with ledgers and maps, where the king sat at a desk buried in paper, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smear of ink along one forearm like he'd been working with his hands as well as his mind. "You look like a man drowning in his own kingdom," Isolde observed, before she could decide whether it was wise to say so. "I am a man drowning in his own kingdom," Cassian said, not looking up. "Sit, if you like, or don't. I find I don't much care for protocol tonight." She sat. On the desk, half buried under other papers, she caught sight of a ledger with the house seal of Halloway Pass pressed into its cover, and beneath it, an older, more weathered book, with a name on the spine that made something in her chest go very still. Bramwell Holdings, assessed. "Why do you have my family's records?" she asked, before she'd decided to. Cassian looked up then, and something guarded crossed his face. Not guilt, she thought, but the recognition of a man realizing he'd left a door unlocked. Because 3 nights ago you told me a border lord's daughter watched her province starve to pay a tithe that doubled without explanation, and I wanted to know if that was true, or grief-talking, or politics. He turned the ledger toward her. It was true. Worse than true, actually. The assessed tithe on Bramwell lands doubled 2 winters ago on the authority of a royal seal I never signed. Isolde went cold. What do you mean? You never signed it? I mean exactly what I said. He pulled another document free. A tithe order. The ink of the royal seal at its base a shade darker, she realized on closer look, than the seal on the documents beside it. Every provincial tithe order requires my signature, and the crown seal both. I've signed hundreds of these in 5 years. I don't remember this one. And when I had Pell pull the register of my own signatures, there's a gap. 6 months, 3 winters back, where every seal was applied, but the ledger of my personal approvals simply stops. He met her eyes. Someone has been raising tithes under my name, and I did not know it until you walked into my throne room and refused to smell like everyone else in it. The room felt suddenly very small and very cold despite the fire. Who has access to the seal? 3 people, myself, the royal scribe, and my regent steward. He said the last title carefully, the way one sets down something that might shatter. Thorne. I don't know that, Cassian said, quickly, sharply, the voice of a man protecting a wound he hasn't examined yet. Alaric has run this crown since my parents died. He was my father's steward before he was mine. I trust him with everything. I have trusted him with everything. Because I was 19 and half mad with grief, and someone had to hold the kingdom together while I remembered how to be a person again. I am not prepared to accuse him on the strength of one ledger discrepancy. Then let's find a second one, Isolde said, and it was not a request, and something in Cassian's face, tired, wary, achingly young beneath the weight he carried, loosened just slightly at the U.S. implied in her words, though neither of them named it aloud. That night, unable to sleep, Isolde found her way to the palace's lower archive, a chamber the stewards rarely bothered with, since it held nothing but old census rolls and pack registries too outdated to matter to anyone managing the kingdom's present business. She went there not because she expected to find anything, but because her mind would not quiet, and the alternative was staring at the ceiling of her small east wing chamber, counting the ways a kingdom could rot from the inside without anyone noticing until the roof came down. The archive smelled of dust and tallow, and something older beneath it, parchment gone brittle with a century of handling. An elderly clerk named Master Fenwick, who apparently slept among his ledgers more often than not, blinked awake at her entrance and, once he understood she meant no harm to his careful stacks, proved unexpectedly willing to talk. You want to know about the bond wards, he said, when she asked him, haltingly, why a king's mate mattered so much to a kingdom's borders. A question she'd been too proud to ask Cassian directly, not wanting him to think her interest in him was purely mercenary, a means to an end rather than what it was slowly, unnervingly becoming. It's old magic, my lady. Older than this dynasty. A Lycan king's bond isn't sentiment dressed up as policy. It's the literal architecture holding the pack magic steady. Every ward at every border, every treaty line drawn through wolf territory, draws its strength from the king's own bond magic. A king alone is a candle. A king bonded true is a hearth. The difference isn't in how warm he feels, my lady. It's in how far the heat reaches. And if the bond is faked, forced, a political match with no true feeling behind it? Fenwick's expression turned grave. Then you get a candle wearing a hearth's clothes. It looks the same from a distance. It even holds for a time, sometimes years, if the parties are disciplined and dutiful. But it frays at the edges no one's watching, my lady. The border wards, usually. The distant provinces. the places furthest from the palace, where a false bond's thin heat runs out before it arrives. He tapped a brittle page in front of him, a genealogical chart, generations of Ashworth kings and their queens, several names crossed through in faded ink. There, King Aldrich III, 2 centuries back. Married for alliance, not bond. Halloway province lost its wards within 9 years. It took his son's true bond, decades later, to restore them. Isolde sat with that a long while after Fenwick had returned to his ledgers, turning it over the way she turned over a suspicious column of figures, looking for where the story someone told did not match the numbers underneath it. Halloway, always Halloway. The same province whose wards were thinning now, under a Regent Steward who had every incentive to ensure the crown's attention stayed anywhere else. She did not yet understand, that night, how precisely the pieces would lock together, that Thorne's decade of quiet theft depended not only on ledgers no one checked, but on a king who remained deliberately unbonded, whose grief he had, perhaps, found ways to prolong rather than heal. Because a king too wounded to marry was a king too distracted to audit his own treasury. But she felt the shape of it, the way one feels a storm system pressing at the edge of a clear sky, and she went to find Cassian earlier than she'd intended, the ledgers forgotten for a moment in favor of a harder question. How many candidates did Thorne recommend against before this trial? She asked him, finding him still awake, as she'd somehow known she would. Cassian frowned. A few. Over the years, he always had reasons. A house with debts, a temperament he judged unsuitable, a family with old grudges against the crown. I trusted his judgment. He knew the nobility better than I did. I was buried in grief half the years he was making those recommendations. Did any of the women he approved of ever actually reach a formal betrothal? The silence that followed told her everything Cassian hadn't yet let himself realize. No, he said slowly. Somehow, no. Something always fell through. A scandal surfaced. A better match appeared. I never once questioned it. Because Alaric always had a reasonable explanation, and I was... He stopped. Too tired to look past a reasonable explanation, Isolde finished gently, because she recognized the particular exhaustion of a man who had learned to let someone else carry the weight of decisions, and how easily that trust curdled, unnoticed, into control. He needed me unbonded, Cassian said, the realization settling over his face like a physical weight. A bonded king audits his own accounts. A bonded king rides his own borders. A grieving, unmarried king lets his steward run the kingdom and calls it kindness. 10 years is a long time to keep a candle burning low on purpose, Isolde said quietly, so that no one notices the hearth beside it has gone cold. They worked past midnight in the study, over the ledgers. She had grown up doing her father's books when his hands shook too badly to hold a pen straight, and she knew the particular grammar of a ledger that had been made to lie. The 2 round numbers, the entries just slightly out of sequence, the totals that added up on the page but not in the world. By the time the candles had burned to stubs, they had found 4 more provinces with tithes raised under signatures Cassian did not remember giving, all funneling through a chain of shell accounts registered to trading houses with unfamiliar names, toward the Halloway silver mines. The same mines, Isolde realized with a jolt, whose border wards had been thinning for 2 years, while the Crown's response was, as she'd told him on the first night, nothing but a letter. Someone is selling silver rights out from under the Crown, she said slowly, and taxing the border provinces to fund the operation, and letting the wards fail because maintaining them properly would require inspectors who might notice the mines are producing less silver for the treasury than they're pulling from the ground. Cassian's jaw was tight. And if the wards fail entirely, then whatever's beyond the Ashvale tree line stops being a story you tell children, Isolde finished, and becomes a war nobody in this palace is prepared for. Because everyone's too busy managing a trial for your marriage bed to notice the kingdom's bones are being sold for scrap, He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ledgers as if they might rearrange themselves into something less true. "You understand," he said finally, "that if this trail leads where I fear it leads, I am about to lose the only steady thing I've had since I was 19 years old." "I understand that better than you might think," Isolde said, and did not elaborate, though she thought of her father again, and the particular grief of discovering that the hand you trusted to steady you had been the one bleeding you dry all along. Cassian looked at her then. Really looked, the way he had that first night, an open, unshielded breath, as if trying to catch some scent beneath the ink and candle smoke and exhaustion. "You still don't smell like a lie," he said quietly. "I've had you in this room for 6 hours, discussing evidence that could end a man I've called family for a decade, and you haven't once reached for something soft to say to make it easier. Would you want me to?" "No," he said, with a certainty that surprised them both. "God help me, no. I think I've had 11 years of soft, easy things said to me by people who wanted something, and I didn't know how starved I was for someone who'd rather tell me the truth than tell me what I wanted to hear." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Thorne will want to know why you're still here. Officially, I mean. There are 29 other candidates waiting for an answer, and my counsel will start asking why the trial hasn't concluded. Tell them I failed spectacularly," Isolde said. "Tell them whatever keeps me in this room long enough to find out who forged your signature." "I don't think I can tell them you failed," Cassian said, and there was something rueful and unguarded in it, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not have time to examine. "I think, Lady Bramwell, you may be the only thing in this entire kingdom that hasn't." A knock came at the door then, brisk and untimely, and Pell's voice through the wood. "Your Majesty, Steward Thorne requests an audience. He says it's urgent. Something regarding tomorrow's provincial council and the Halloway assessment." Isolde and Cassian exchanged a single look, and in it passed an entire unspoken agreement. The ledgers, gathered quickly, vanished into a locked drawer. The Bramwell Holdings book slid beneath a stack of unrelated correspondence. And by the time the door opened, and Alaric Thorne stepped through with his too smooth smile, and his eyes that flicked once, assessingly, toward Isolde still seated by the fire, the study looked like nothing more than a king working late, and a candidate who had, perhaps, overstayed a private audience. "Lady Bramwell?" Thorne said, his voice pleasant, his eyes not. "Still here. How industrious of you." "I find I have very little else to do," Isolde said, "while I wait to learn whether I've won or lost." Said Thorne, and smiled wider, and Isolde thought, watching him, that she had never in her life seen a man smile with such warmth and mean it so little, and she understood, with the particular clarity of the very frightened, that whatever came next, this man could not be allowed to learn how much they already knew. The provincial council convened the next morning in a chamber Isolde was not invited to, and so she spent the hours pacing the kitchen gardens instead, turning over everything she and Cassian had found the night before, until Celestine found her among the turnip rows looking, by her own description, like a woman planning either a wedding or a war. "Possibly both," Isolde admitted, and then, because Celestine had shown her nothing but honesty since the marble hall, and because she needed someone outside the tangle of palace loyalties to help her think, she told her, carefully, in pieces, leaving out the parts that were not hers to give away, that something was rotten in the Crown's accounts, and that the rot led toward Halloway. Celestine went very still. "Halloway," she repeated. "My cousin married into a trading house that does business near Halloway. Vasilov Trading. I've heard my uncle complain for a year that Vasilov's been buying silver contracts below market rate from someone inside the Crown's own assessor's office. He assumed it was corruption at the provincial level, some minor official skimming. He never thought to look higher." "Vasilov," Isolde repeated slowly. The name meant nothing to her directly, but she remembered, with a lurch, one of the shell accounts from the ledgers the night before. A trading concern registered under a name she'd taken for decoration, ornamental, meaningless. V. Trading concern, Halloway Registry. Celestine, I need everything you know about Vasilov trading, and I need it before this council session ends. What Celestine knew, and what she gathered further that afternoon, through a network of cousins and correspondents, that made Isolde newly grateful for the particular usefulness of noblewomen everyone underestimated, painted a picture uglier than either of them had guessed. Vasilov trading was not merely buying underpriced silver contracts. It was, according to shipping manifests, Celestine's cousin had mentioned in passing months ago without understanding their significance, exporting silver in quantities far exceeding what Halloway's official production records showed. Silver that, by rights, belonged to the crown. Silver that was instead being sold quietly across the western border to buyers who did not ask questions, while the crown's own treasury recorded Halloway as a mine in slow, unexplainable decline. And Vasilov Trading, its ownership structure buried under 4 shell registrations, 3 false directors, and 1 deliberately illegible signature, ultimately traced back. Celestine's cousin confirmed it that evening, in a letter delivered by a bribed palace courier, to a silent partner whose name had been carefully, meticulously kept off every public document, Alaric Thorne. The letter confirming Thorne's silent partnership had barely dried before the danger of what they now knew made itself known in a far more immediate way. Isolde was crossing the servants' passage between the kitchen gardens and the east wing near midnight, the letter folded against her ribs beneath her cloak, when a figure stepped from the shadow of the stairwell. Not Thorne himself, but a man she did not recognize, broad-shouldered, moving with the particular economy of someone paid to be quiet and efficient, rather than seen. "Lady Bramwell," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice raised every hair on her arms. "Lord Thorne wonders whether a border candidate wouldn't be happier concluding her business here and returning home. Ashvale roads can be dangerous this time of year. Washed-out bridges, bandits in the low passes. A woman traveling without a proper escort might find herself in difficulty a long way from any help." It was not, on its face, a threat. Every word of it could be repeated to a council as simple concern for a young woman's safety. That was, she understood with a cold clarity, precisely the point. Thorne had spent a decade learning to make cruelty sound like courtesy. "I'll bear that in mind," Isolde said, keeping her voice steady through will alone, and did not run, though every instinct told her to, because she would not give this man the satisfaction of watching her flee down a servant's corridor. She walked, deliberately unhurried, until she reached a doorway with enough traffic that the stranger fell back into the shadows he'd come from. And only then, safely behind a locked door, did she allow her hands to shake. She did not tell Cassian that night, not immediately. Some old, hard-learned instinct from years of managing her father's collapsing finances told her to gather more before she brought him a fear he could do nothing yet to fix. But she told Celestine, in a whisper, the next morning, and Celestine's face went the particular white of a woman, recalculating exactly how dangerous a decade of quiet theft could make a man once he sensed the walls closing in. "You need to tell him," Celestine said. "Tonight. Whatever pride keeps you from it, set it down, Isolde. A man who forges royal seals for 3 years won't hesitate to remove a border candidate from a hallway if he judges her a bigger risk than a bandit story can explain." She did tell him that evening, watching something in Cassian's face go very still and very dangerous in a way she had not yet seen. Not the tired, grieving young man from the throne room steps, but something older beneath it, a king's fury banked low and controlled. "He threatened you," Cassian said, each word deliberate. "He implied a threat cleverly enough that no council in the kingdom could call it one. That is a distinction that matters to lawyers, not to me." He was already moving toward the door, already calling for Pell, already arranging, over her objection that she did not need guarding like a piece of the crown's own silver, for 2 of his most trusted personal guard to shadow her at a discreet distance for the remainder of her time in the palace. "I have already lost the ability to protect this kingdom from a man I trusted for a decade," he said, quieter now, meeting her eyes. "I will not also fail to protect the one person in it who's told me the truth, since before I remember what truth sounded like. You may argue with me about council matters, Isolde. You will not win this one." She did not argue further, though she noted, with a warmth she did not examine too closely, in the middle of so much danger, that this was the first time in the entire ordeal that being protected had not felt like being managed. Isolde brought the evidence to Cassian that night in his study, and watched him go through 4 stages of a grief she recognized because she had lived a version of it herself. Disbelief, then anger, then a terrible, quiet grief for the version of Alaric Thorne who had, perhaps once, genuinely loved his king, and finally something colder and more useful, the grief compressing itself into resolve. "There's more," Isolde said gently, because there was, and because she had spent the walk to his study deciding whether to tell him, and had concluded that a king who trusted her only for truths that didn't hurt was not a king who trusted her at all. "The tithe increases. Bramwell lands, 3 winters back. I looked at the dates again. Cassian. They align with when my father was accused, falsely, though the crown never overturned it, of smuggling silver across the border himself. He lost his seat on the border council over it. He lost half our lands paying the fines. And I think now that the smuggling he was accused of was Thorne's smuggling, and my father was made the scapegoat, so that no one would look twice at where the silver was actually going." Cassian's expression, when he understood what she was telling him, was not pity. She would not have forgiven pity. But something harder and more honest. Recognition of a debt the crown owed her that had nothing to do with trials or bonds or thrones. "Your family didn't just suffer under bad policy," he said slowly. "You suffered because Alaric needed a name to bleed, so his own would stay clean. Yes. And you came here anyway, knowing this palace had already ruined you once. I came here because my sister was too sick to, and because oath-breaking would have ruined what little we have left," Isolde said. "I didn't know, when I walked in, that the ruin had a name. I know now." Cassian rose from the desk, crossed to the window, and stood a long moment looking out over a kingdom he'd just learned was being sold beneath his feet by the one man he'd trusted since he was a grieving boy of 19. "The council votes tomorrow on the Halloway assessment," he said finally. "Alaric will present a report. I've seen the draft, recommending the crown formally write off Halloway's declining yield and reduce our military presence at the border wards there, citing cost. It would hand him, effectively, unsupervised control of a mine he's already been quietly emptying, at the exact moment the wards protecting that region grow thin enough to make anyone who investigates too closely disappear into a story about wolves beyond the tree line. Then we can't let the council vote on his report." "No," Cassian agreed. "We need proof he can't argue away, not shell registrations and shipping manifests a clever lawyer could call coincidence, but something with his own hand in it, the forged tithe seals." He turned back to her, something sharpening in his gaze, the exhaustion of the last week burning away into purpose. "The royal seal isn't just wax and a signet ring. It's warded, Lycan blood magic, set into the ring itself at my coronation, tuned to my blood alone. No forgery can replicate the ward's signature, not truly, only its appearance. If Alaric has been using a false seal, there will be a discrepancy any court mage could detect in an instant. If we can get the tithe orders in front of one before Alaric has a chance to destroy them or explain them away." "Then that's what we do," Isolde said. "Tonight, before the council convenes." They did not sleep. Pell, whom Cassian trusted with the particular loyalty of a man who had served 3 kings and buried 2 of them, was sent quietly to fetch the crown's oldest ward mage from her tower chambers, a woman named Sister Aveline, who examined the 6 forged tithe orders under candlelight and lambent violet witch fire and pronounced, within 20 minutes, that the seals were counterfeit. "Expertly done," she said. "Done by someone who had studied the true ward's signature closely, and for years, but counterfeit nonetheless, missing the particular resonance that only royal Lycan blood could produce. Whoever forged these," Sister Aveline said, "had access to a genuine impression of the royal seal to copy, which narrows your suspects considerably, Your Majesty, since such impressions are not left lying about." "I know who," Cassian said quietly. "I've known, I think, since last night, and I didn't want to." By dawn, they had assembled what they needed. The 6 forged tithe orders, Sister Aveline's sworn testimony, the Vasilov trading registrations Celestine's cousin had gathered, and the ledger discrepancies Isolde had first flagged 3 nights before. It was not, Cassian admitted grimly, a complete case. A truly determined defense might yet muddy the shell registrations, might argue the forged seals were the work of some lesser clerk acting alone. But it was enough, he judged, to justify what came next. Not a quiet confrontation in a private study, but a public reckoning in the one room where Alaric Thorne had spent a decade being unquestionably believed. "The council chamber," Cassian said. "This morning, in front of every noble house that trial has gathered under this roof. Alaric answers for Halloway in front of witnesses he cannot smooth talk into silence afterward." "He'll fight it," Isolde warned. "A man who spent 10 years being the most trusted voice in this palace doesn't surrender that quietly." "No," Cassian agreed, and something in his face was tired and sad, and resolved all at once. The face of a man about to lose the closest thing he'd had to a father twice over. "He won't. Which is why Isolde," and it was the first time he had used her given name without title, and she felt it land somewhere unguarded in her chest. "I need you beside me when I do this. Not because protocol demands a candidate's presence. Because you're the only person in this palace who's told me the truth since before I can remember, and I find I don't want to face what comes next without that particular scent in the room." The council chamber, when they entered it an hour later, was already full. 30 candidates and their attending families, the full provincial council, and at the head of the long table, Alaric Thorne, resplendent in Regent Steward's formal collar, already rising with a report in hand and a smile prepared for a morning he believed he still controlled. "Your Majesty," Thorne began, "if we might begin with the Halloway assessment." "We will begin," Cassian said, and his voice filled the chamber with an authority Isolde had not yet heard him use. "With the 6 tithe orders bearing a forged royal seal, 3 of which raised taxes on House Bramwell, under a signature I never gave. We will begin, Alaric, with Vasilov trading, and the silver that has been leaving Halloway for 3 years under your silent partnership, sold across a border ward that has been left to thin because a functioning garrison might have noticed the mine was being emptied. We will begin there, and I would very much like you to explain it to this entire council before I decide what comes next." The color left Alaric Thorne's face all at once, and for the first time since Isolde had met him, his smile did not return. For a long moment, no one in the council chamber moved. Then Alaric Thorne did the thing that 10 years of managing a grieving boy-king into a controllable man had taught him to do best. He recovered his composure, smoothed his collar, and smiled. "Your Majesty is understandably tired," he said, his voice pitched for the whole room, warm and reasonable and utterly assured. "The strain of the trial, the long nights. I confess I've worried for your health these past weeks. Forged seals, secret trading concerns. These are serious accusations to levy on the word of a border candidate who has, by all accounts, spent a great deal of unsupervised time alone with you in recent days." His eyes flicked to Isolde, cool and assessing. "One wonders what a clever, ambitious young woman might hope to gain by planting suspicion against the one man who has held this kingdom together in your Majesty's grief." It was, Isolde thought, a masterful move, reframe the accusation as a woman's manipulation, cast doubt not on the evidence, but on her motives, and do it gently enough that half the room would nod along without ever noticing they'd been steered. She felt the weight of 30 noble families' attention swing toward her, weighing, and she made herself stand very straight and did not look away from Thorne's cold, pleasant eyes. "I have gained nothing from this palace but the confirmation of something I've suspected for 3 years," Isolde said, before Cassian could speak, because this accusation had been aimed at her, and she would not let a king, however well-meaning, answer it on her behalf. "My father was ruined by a smuggling charge he did not commit, at the exact moment we now know that someone needed a name to blame for silver disappearing from Crown accounts. If you're suggesting I've fabricated evidence for personal gain, Lord Thorne, I invite you to explain, in front of this entire council, why a forensic ward mage has already confirmed the tithe seals are counterfeit, and why Vasilov Trading's silent partnership documents bear a signature your own scribe will recognize." A ripple went through the chamber. Sister Aveline, seated quietly near the council's edge, rose at Cassian's small nod and confirmed, in the flat, unemotional cadence of a woman whose entire vocation was the impossibility of lying about blood magic, that the 6 tithe seals lacked the royal ward's true resonance, that they were, unambiguously, forgeries. Thorne's composure did not shatter all at once. It eroded instead, in stages Isolde watched with a kind of grim fascination. The smile thinning, the reasonable warmth in his voice curdling by degrees into something sharper, more desperate, as council members who had spent a decade deferring to him began, one by one, to lean subtly away. "Everything I have done," Thorne said finally, his voice dropping the pleasant register entirely. "I have done for this crown. Do you have any idea what it took to hold this kingdom together after your parents died, boy? You were 19. You could barely dress yourself some mornings, let alone rule a nation bordering territory that eats the unwary. I built the systems that kept Ashvale solvent while you grieved. I diverted Halloway's excess yield into contracts that funded border garrisons your own treasury wouldn't authorize, because a 19-year-old king in mourning couldn't be trusted to sign off on wartime spending in peacetime. Everything, the tithes, the trading concerns, all of it, has quietly funded the defenses this kingdom needed, and you were too broken to provide." It was, Isolde recognized, not entirely a lie, which was somehow worse than if it had been. The particular horror of a man who had told himself, for years, a story generous enough to let him sleep, a story with just enough truth in its foundation to make the rot built atop it feel, to him, like necessity rather than theft. She had seen smaller versions of this same self-deception in the men who'd overseen her own province's finances. Men who took a little and called it prudence, then took a little more and called it maintenance, until the taking became the entire architecture and the excuses simply grew to fit it. "Then show us the garrisons your smuggled silver funded," Cassian said quietly. "Show us the wartime spending, because Sister Aveline's mages surveyed the Halloway wards 8 days ago, at my order, before this council ever convened, and they found no reinforcement, Alaric, no new garrison, no spent silver at all, beyond what left this kingdom in Vasilov's shipping crates, bound for buyers across the western border, who will never answer a single question about where it came from, whatever story you have told yourself these 10 years. The wards at Halloway are thinner than they were when my father died, and the silver that should have strengthened them instead made you and your silent partners very wealthy men." Thorne's mouth opened and closed, and for one unguarded moment, Isolde saw something genuinely human move behind his eyes. Not guilt, precisely, but the particular vertigo of a man realizing the story he'd told himself for a decade could not survive contact with the evidence in the room. Then it was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating, a man assessing his remaining exits. "You'll need more than a border girl's grudge and a mage's word to move this council against me," he said. But the certainty had gone out of his voice, and around the table, Isolde watched noble families who had spent 10 years deferring to Alaric Thorne begin quietly to withdraw their trust. Lord Rowe leaning to whisper to a colleague, Lady Vashti's mother drawing her chair fractionally back from the table's head. "I don't need to move this council," Cassian said. "I am the crown, Alaric. The seal is warded to my blood, not to your convenience. And you forged it 6 times over to bleed my border provinces for a fortune you funneled to yourself under cover of a war that never came. The council will vote, yes, on whether to strip you of your regency and remand you to crown justice, or whether 30 noble houses believe a man's decade of service excuses 3 years of theft dressed as sacrifice. But I think you already know which way that vote will fall, because I watched it fall the moment Sister Aveline spoke. The vote, when it came, was not close." Alaric Thorne was escorted from the council chamber by the captain of the palace guard before the noon bells rang, his regency stripped, his trading concerns seized pending crown investigation, his decade of careful management unraveling into a scandal that would occupy Ashvale's courts for a year to come. Though Isolde noted, with some private satisfaction, that Cassian insisted on due process even then, on a proper trial rather than a summary execution, because, he told her quietly afterward, he refused to become a king who solved betrayal with the same lawlessness that had enabled it. The stranger who had cornered Isolde in the servants' passage was identified within days as a mercenary long in Vasilov Trading's private employ, and his testimony, offered readily once Thorne's protection evaporated, closed the last gap in the case against his former employer, confirming under Crown questioning that he had been instructed to make the border candidate's continued presence in the palace feel unsafe enough that she would leave before the council ever convened. It was, Sister Aveline observed dryly, the closest thing to a written confession Thorne would ever provide, having been too careful a man to put his worst intentions on paper, but not careful enough to remember that hired men, once abandoned, rarely stay loyal to a master already in chains. The trial of 30 was formally dissolved that same week, by royal decree, with a public statement, drafted, at Cassian's insistence, jointly by himself and Isolde, that no future Ashvale monarch would ever again be expected to choose a spouse through a contest of flattery, that the crown's marriage would be a matter of the heart and the bond alone, not a pageant staged by advisors with their own fortunes to protect. Lady Celestine Rowe, whose quiet gathering of shipping records had done more to unravel Thorne's decade of theft than any single ledger, was offered a permanent position advising the Crown's treasury on provincial trade. An offer she accepted, she told Isolde later, with the particular fierce joy of a 4th daughter who had finally been asked to be something other than furniture. House Bramwell's tithe was not merely reduced, but formally struck from Crown record as unlawfully levied. The false smuggling charge against Isolde's father overturned in a public proclamation that restored, at last, the family name he had spent 3 years apologizing for losing. Isolde received the news in a letter from her sister 3 weeks later, Marguerite's handwriting shaky with recovered strength and unrecovered disbelief, and she wept over it in the same window seat in the palace library, where she had first admitted to Celestine that she didn't much care what she got out of this trial, only that her family stopped drowning. It was there Cassian found her, some weeks after, the kingdom's ledgers finally balanced, the border garrisons finally reinforced with silver that flowed, for the first time in 3 years, exactly where the Crown's own records said it did. "I never formally asked you," he said, standing in the library doorway with the particular awkwardness of a man who had faced down a decade of betrayal with more composure than he now managed over a simple question. "Everything happened so quickly. The council, the trial, Alaric. I never once asked whether you wanted this, a crown, me, any of it." "You're asking now," Isolde said. "I'm asking now." He crossed the room and knelt, not with the practiced grace of court ceremony, but with the plain, unguarded earnestness of the man she'd first met sitting on the steps of his own throne, too tired to bother with its trappings. "I don't have a rehearsed speech, Isolde. I have a kingdom that nearly bled to death while the man I trusted most called it sacrifice, and I have you, who walked into my throne room smelling of nothing but rain and refused, from the very first breath, to tell me a single comfortable lie. I don't know what love is supposed to feel like for a Lycan king. The old stories make it sound like thunder, like certainty. What I feel is quieter than that. It feels like finally being able to trust the ground I'm standing on. I would like to spend the rest of my life standing on it with you, if you'll have me. Outside the tall library windows, rain had begun again. The same silver rope fall that had greeted her the first morning she'd arrived at these gates in her dead mother's cloak, certain she was walking into a farce staged for a king who didn't deserve his throne. She thought of the 30 women who had come before her with practiced compliments and borrowed perfume, and of the one honest thing she'd had to offer instead. Not flattery, never flattery, only the truth, however unwelcome, however costly. "I refused to flatter you the first time you asked me to," Isolde said, and knelt too, so that they were level, so that neither of them had to look up or down to see the other clearly. "I don't intend to start now, Cassian. If you want a wife who tells you comfortable lies, I am the wrong woman entirely. But if you want someone who will always, always tell you what the ledgers actually say, yes, I'll have you. I'll have all of it. The kingdom, the ledgers, the reign." He laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded, the sound of a man setting down a weight he'd carried since he was 19, and kissed her there in the library, rain drumming soft against old glass. 30 candidates worth of flattery finally, quietly, outdone by a single refusal to give it. Later, much later, when the border wards at Halloway had held strong through 2 full winters, and House Bramwell's name was spoken again without apology, the people of Ashvale would tell the story of the trial of 30 differently than the histories first recorded it, not as a contest of 30 women vying for a crown, but as the story of the one woman who walked in owing the palace nothing, and told it the truth anyway, and in doing so, saved it. What is a kingdom, after all, but a ledger someone finally decided to balance honestly? And what is love, if not the first voice in a very long silence willing to tell you the truth?